Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome again to the third session of our Teacher Dialogue series, which is being co-hosted by the School of Education and the Mehboob ul Haq Research Center's Education Cluster at LUMS, the Lahore University of Management Sciences. You must be familiar with this platform by now. This is the 105th session. And next week, we're going to kind of culminate and wrap up our dialogue series with an in-person session. So if you're on campus, if you're a student at LUMS, if you're a student somewhere in Pakistan, especially in Lahore, at a faculty or a school of education, we look forward to hosting you next week on campus when we have a fun blend of a wrap-up of our entire series, as well as a mix of activities and problem-solving sessions related to all the issues that have been thrown up and will continue to be thrown up over the course of this session. Today's episode is going to be looking at this, really important and difficult question of whether teaching is a profession in Pakistan. And, we understand that might raise a few eyebrows here and there because some of you will think, of course it is. But by and large, that's not the narrative that we know accompanies school teaching in this country. And it's a huge motivation for why we started this dialogue series. So today we're really lucky to have, our global speaker is Dr. Yui Hua. She's a research fellow with the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. Yui works with the RISE program, which is Research on Improving Systems of Education, which is a large cross-country program, which is unpacking education systems from multiple dimensions. And the one that we're focusing on today is teachers. We're also joined locally on the Pakistan perspective by Dr. Shahid Siddiqui, who is Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, Media Studies, and Art and Design at the Lahore School of Economics here in Lahore. Welcome to you both. Thank you very much for taking out the time to join us today. We're looking forward to a really exciting, and I'm going to be controversial and say we're looking forward to a contentious discussion today because that's the need of the hour for this topic in Pakistan. So I think everyone who's watching by now knows the drill. I'm Sophia Siddiqui. I'm assistant professor at the School of Education. Thanks for joining, and we're going to get started. Yui, do you want to start us off with the global perspective?
Sure thing. Let me find my slides, and as I do so, I just wanted to say I'm really looking forward for the opportunity to share some research and also to learn more about the context in Pakistan. So thank you for having me. Sophia mentioned I work at RISE, based at University of Oxford, and RISE stands for Research on Improving Systems of Education. And my role there specifically is to synthesize research across countries on teachers and management. So for this dialogue, what I'm going to try to do is to bring some insights from sort of the broader policy research and the broader cross-country context, and then learn from Dr. Siddiqui about the Pakistan context, which I'm looking forward to. So just to give you a sense of where RISE works, we're in 7 developing countries, including Pakistan. So for example, Sophia herself, as well as Tahir and Drabi, are some of the people who have done studies for our Pakistan country research team, and I'm sure they're familiar to many on this call. I'm personally, despite being based in the UK, I'm actually from Malaysia, very proud of being Malaysian, and that's where I attended school, that's where I taught in a school as well for 2 years. And so in our work at RISE on synthesizing research across countries on teachers and teacher careers, we really start with a vision of where we think the teaching profession should be, and that's of empowered, highly respected, strongly performance normed, contextually embedded teaching professions that cultivate student learning. But unfortunately, compared to frontline realities for most teachers in many countries, this really is quite a lofty vision that doesn't reflect their day-to-day experiences. Just to give you an illustration of what I mean by those day-to-day realities. So as many of you know, even before the COVID pandemic and school closures, there's been a learning crisis affecting many developing countries, including Pakistan, so if you look just at the purple bar on the left, among 10-year-old children who are enrolled in school, almost half of them aren't learning despite being in school. And this is an average across all low and middle income countries. And this gap between expectations and reality also affects teachers. So if you look at the blue boxes, this is survey data in South Africa in 2007. So among 6th grade teachers, they had completed an average of 3.3 years of teacher training, and 74% of them had completed at least senior secondary school. but only 1/5 of them could pass a 6th grade maths test, even though this is the stuff they were supposed to be teaching to their students. And besides competence levels, commitment levels can also be a challenge. So for example, in the service development indicators, this was in 8 African countries, 40% of teachers were absent from classroom. So either they weren't in school at all, or they were in school, but they weren't in their scheduled classes. And also given today's topic, so there are widespread failures, unfortunately, in pre-service teacher education as well. So this is a study of a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And then we also see that these systems struggle to deliver pre-service teacher education that really can prepare teachers for classroom realities. We see that on the left. And also teacher education where teachers have access to experienced teacher mentors and access to real classroom practice and coaching in that classroom practice. So these are issues that Lant, Pritchett, and I try to discuss in a primer or a short book about teacher careers that we recently finished. And one thing we argue in this primer is that if we want to move from these sad realities to the vision of an empowered and respected teaching profession, we really need to recognize that classroom teaching is complex, and that complex in many ways, right? So to begin with, teaching serves many goals. So we want to cultivate learning, but we also want to cultivate values. We want to cultivate dispositions. Also, every classroom is an open system. It's affected by all kinds of things from children's lives, right? Did a child get a good meal in the morning? Are they feeling happy today? Is the weather bad? All of that can affect the interaction between teacher and student. And teachers face all kinds of interacting constraints. So basically there's a lot going on and it's complex. And teacher careers themselves are also really complex. And in this primer, Lant and I talk about 3 different kinds of complexity. So one is just that teacher career structures themselves are made out of lots of different things. So there are different design elements, which are the rows in light blue. And these design elements can all vary across phases of teacher careers, which are the columns in orange. So for example, if you look at that yellow cell, that's support in the pre-service phase. So one aspect of pre-service teacher training, if you change what goes on in that yellow cell, it can have knock-on effects on the types of responsibilities. So the delegation at the top row that you can reasonably and feasibly delegate to teachers at all phases of their careers, right? Because if you don't train them to do something, you can't reasonably expect people to do it. So and one thing we try to emphasize in this framework is that these interactions really affect what actually happens on the ground. And actually, I think Sajid Ali said something related to this in the last session of this dialogue. He said something like, we need to conceptualize teacher management as a whole system, and we can't have good professional teachers if we think about preparation in isolation, recruitment in isolation, and continuation in isolation. But unfortunately, that is what many education systems do. And that quote about fragmentation and incoherence is from the International Task Force for Teachers 2030, which is an international and inter-organizational alliance based at UNESCO. So that's a consistent pattern that they see and that in our research we have seen as well across countries. And so besides complexity in that design of teacher career policy, this is another area of complexity we think about, which is that teacher motivation itself is made out of many interacting components. So on the left, you see sort of the more material related motivational components. And then on the right, you see the more psychological and social motivational components. So the personal satisfaction that you get from fulfilling your own goals or from identifying with a bigger purpose, or the social validation and appreciation you get from other people. And what we also find is that some teacher policy reforms tend to focus on changing finances over everything else. Like, so sometimes people argue that because teachers are unmotivated and have low status, we should raise their pay and that will fix everything. Now, just to say, it's completely true, teachers should be paid enough to have a good quality of life to reflect their capability and commitment, but there are so many other factors that affect teacher well-being and performance. And we don't want an education system where the main reason people choose to become a teacher is that it pays well. We want teachers to be about so much more than that, right? And also we have evidence from, for example, in Indonesia, there was a reform that basically doubled the base salary of every certified civil service teacher, and there was no effect on student learning whatsoever. So again, like finances unfortunately can't solve everything. So talk about complexity in motivation, complexity in teacher careers. So another level of complexity that we think it's important to think about is just the organizations teachers are embedded in. So whether these are ministries or bureaucracies or large private school system. And we argue that any effective organization really is effective from the inside out. And at that inside, at that core, we have a combination of an overarching shared purpose in orange and a set of technical practices that aim to advance that purpose. And the core, it's surrounded by different functions like human resources, like IT, and so on. But the problem is that sometimes an organization can lose its core and become what my co-author likes to call a donut. So an organization can become a donut if it loses the commitment to the technical practices at its core. So maybe the situation has changed, so the practices aren't effective anymore. And in education systems, that often happens when you had a system that just served the children of the elite. But then when you expand to serve children from more different backgrounds, then the curriculum and teaching practices, the technical part, just aren't good enough to meet the needs of all these diverse children. Or an organization can also become a donut if the shared purpose at the center is eroded. So for example, our Indonesia and India country research teams have documented pretty widespread cheating in some national exams. And what that suggests is that the core purpose really has become achieving exam scores rather than actually cultivating student learning. So instead of working to improve the technical practices that foster student learning, people work instead to find strategies to inflate exam scores. I'm just going to skip this. Okay, so this was the thing I wanted to note. So across all these three levels of complexity I talked about, so the design elements of teacher careers and the sources of teacher motivation and the structure of the organization, you see that purpose is fundamental to all of these layers. It's in personal satisfaction and social validation, it's in delegation, so the responsibilities and why we delegate those responsibilities, and in the norms that shape professions, and it's at the core of effective organizations. So that was all kind of background. So with all of that in mind, we propose a set of principles for teacher careers that we call the 5 C's. And the 5 C's stand for choose and curate toward commitment to capable and committed teachers. And I'll explain a little bit of that. And if you recall what I was just saying about technical practices and purpose at the core, actually, we see that when we talk about capability, that relates to technical practices. And we talk about commitment, that relates to purpose. And just to show you what this can look like, I'll give you an illustration of typical approach in civil service, then I'll show you what I think it can look like in the 5 C's. So in the typical civil service setting, there really isn't much turnover of teachers over their careers. Most teachers just enter pre-service teaching and kind of stick around until retirement at some point at the end. And in many education systems, and I believe in Pakistan to some extent, a civil service teaching post is seen as a stable job with good benefits. So you might have a little dropout of novice teachers at the beginning, but most people stay in the profession, or at least in the civil service long term. And that's partly because even though the first few months or years of your novice phase might be called probation, there aren't really any good evaluations or good measures of whether you're really serving your students. So at the end of probation, pretty much everyone gets a permanent job unless they really, really messed up somehow. But under the 5 C's, so this is just an illustrative example, we expect that actually quite a lot of people will leave the profession, so that drop off here, in the first few years of their careers, but then after that, there's relatively little turnover. And note that this is just an illustrative example. So we do make the drop off look quite dramatic just to make the point. And in practice, this will look different. But we do think that in any context, it's really important for teachers to get significant classroom practice in the pre-service and novice phases, and to really be able to tell if they can feel capable and committed to the profession long-term, and for the system to be able to tell if they will be capable and committed long-term before making a permanent employment commitment. And obviously this is costly in some ways because some of the people you train would be in the system long-term, but we think it's really important to have this idea of curate, so both getting extensive practice and extensive support, and identifying teachers. And I'll show you quickly why. So we think this curate thing really matters because it goes back to the fact that classroom teaching is complex. And what that complexity implies is that the factors that really matter most for classroom teaching, they can't be captured very well by measurements and indicators that can be standardized and measured at a large scale. So this is a quote from a large panel study of students and teachers this is using LEAP's data in rural Punjab for people familiar with the data set by Natalie Bao and Vishnu Das. And they found that measurable observed teacher characteristics could only explain less than 5% of the variation in how much teachers contributed to their student learning. And this is despite the fact that the indicators included things like teaching experience, included things like teachers' own scores on the tests the students took. And some studies in the US have had similar findings. So this suggests that we need better information basically about teacher practice. So, and also interestingly, the same study found that in the private sector, in this data set, even though there wasn't systematic assessment, schools and head teachers could identify which teachers were effective and were paying them more. And what this suggests is that when you want to really recognize quality in teaching, really the granular on the ground experience and observation matters more than any standardized measurements that go in our EMIS systems. So basically in this work, Lant and I argue that if it were true that standardized scores could capture everything we value about teaching, maybe teacher careers could depend wholly on choose and wouldn't need choose and curate. But because both theory and empirical data suggest that teaching is just too complex to be reduced to these standardized measurements, then curation, including this experience and practical component, can be really important for identifying capable and committed teachers. And just to say a personal note, so when Lant and I first started talking about this curate thing, at first I was like, oh, I'm not sure if I agree. It sounds so wasteful to train many people who won't become teachers long-term. But then two things convinced me. So I looked more at the research on employment and turnover in different professions, and actually across professions, when there is more turnover, you tend to get what is called better job match, and better job match leads to better productivity, both for the individual and for the organization. And then also I reflected on my own experience of teaching English in a high-needs secondary school through Teach for Malaysia. I think it was Teach for Pakistan. And before I went in, people said to me, oh, your exam scores are so good, you'll be a good teacher. But then I got to an actual classroom and I found that my students liked me, but they didn't necessarily want to listen to me because I wasn't good at maintaining discipline. So they weren't learning as much as they should. And because I knew I wasn't good at classroom management, that's actually quite demotivating to me. And I don't think I'd have survived as a teacher long term. I found I'm better at being like a nerdy researcher, so that works well. But the thing is, I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't experienced the classroom firsthand. So the combination of the large scale cross-country, cross-occupation research and thinking about my own experience really convinced me that this curation element, I think people like firsthand experience really, really matters before we decide who makes up the teaching profession long-term. Right, I'm going to skip this. That's the rest of the 5 C's. I can talk about it later if we have time. But anyway, so all of this teacher careers 5 C stuff was sort of from the perspective of the system and of policy. I'm going to talk a bit about something from the perspective of the teacher. And this is a project I'm currently working on where I interviewed 28 experts in 14 paired interviews to gather their insights on teacher norms. And one of the interviews included Sophia Siddiqui. And I'm still analyzing the interview transcripts, but what my initial analysis suggests is that there are lots of competing factors and levels for teachers. So there's selves or what the teacher personally values, then the situations or their perception of what can be done in their classrooms and schools. And then there's standards, so teachers' perceptions of what the government and school principals, authorities, whatever want them to do, whether that's officially stated or an informal expectation. And all of these are influenced by other things in society. So like politics, religious and social values, the job market, and so on. And my hypothesis is that with all of these competing priorities, teacher practices that are most likely to happen and become dominant norms are those that occur at the overlap. So where self situations and standards overlap. I'll give you 2 examples from the interviews quickly. So this is a participant who was a teacher in Botswana. And she said, when she first became a teacher, she was thinking, oh, I'm going to be innovative. I'm going to make things fun and be creative. And I'm going to help both the kids who are struggling and those who are doing well. But then when she got to the school, she just had so much to deal, so many students, so many classrooms that it wasn't feasible. And then she realized that like everyone above her was saying, you need to do the curriculum, you need to, fulfill the tests and like meet all these targets. So here's the first norm. So because of all of that, and because of course, even though she wanted to be creative, another thing that every person values is I need to not lose my job so I can actually keep eating. So one norm became, she's just going to focus on the curriculum, even though it wasn't feasible within her situation to deliver all of it perfectly. She just would teach it superficially because you just have to. And then, so meeting the needs of children and prioritizing them became something that you don't do. So it's not within the self's priorities. The timetable added further constraints to what she could do. And so one dominant norm that emerges at the center is that the teacher says there's so much she needs to do, she doesn't have time to do it, and you don't like what you're doing, and then your kids suffer. And this is sadly something that I heard across many different interviews. Here's another one. This is actually from Masuda Bano, who's a Pakistani scholar of international development. And she was talking about her research with students who performed extraordinarily well, even in challenging situations. And so this example focuses on a small group of teachers who have their own teaching norm that breaks away from the mainstream low performance norm. And yeah, they really helped kids to go above and beyond. And the students describe them as going well beyond the standard. So it's beyond, see, this doesn't fall within what is officially expected. But the teachers believed in helping students, partly because they saw that within the Islamic religious tradition they were part of, and also because they just took pride in their work, like as true professionals. And that's just to say some of the religious motivation came from society. But then Professor Bano noted that unfortunately, all the international development literature now is just talking about financial incentives, like I mentioned just now, and there's really a need to balance the two, but the state and donors seem to struggle to do that. And that's true of many contexts that I've looked at. Let's skip that. Okay, so where does teacher training fit into all of this? Where does initial teacher education fit in? So looking at this teacher norms one that I just showed, I think in this framework for teachers' perspective and norms, if you look at the bottom right, I think well-aligned training can make it more feasible for teachers to achieve expected standards within their situations, because if teachers are more capable, then there's more overlap, more convergence between standards and situations. And if you look toward the left, another thing about teacher education, it's not just about technical things, but it's also socialization and building shared values and shared vision. So well-designed teacher training, I think, can help teachers move toward being more committed and more equipped for the possibilities and situations they find themselves in. And this is just to recap from a slide from a long time ago. So pre-service teacher education, actually, even though you'd think it would just fit in support, it fits into all these different aspects of pre-service teacher education because it signals what responsibilities they should do and why. It gives information on what they're doing and so on. And again, like it kind of knock-on effects in all the rest of the feedback loops of the phases. I did also just want to mention that in our research on teacher careers, we do see that there are many different models and ways to get this extensive classroom practice component, this curate component in. So some people see Finland as the gold standard, and in every Finnish university that trains teachers, there's a school attached, like a regular school for regular kids, attached to the faculty of education. So that means that throughout their training, these pre-service teachers go in and teach in regular classrooms and are always monitored by the teacher who manages that, the experienced teacher who manages that classroom. Singapore, interestingly, has quite a different approach, even though some people also see them as the gold standard. What they do is that before you actually go in for your teacher training, so you get your bachelor's, you apply for teacher training, you get in, but before you actually enter teacher training, as a postgrad degree, you need to teach in a school for a number of months, untrained. So they sort of throw you in the deep end to experience the classroom. So by the time you get to your lectures or teacher education, you know what it's like firsthand and gives you that context. In a much more resource constrained way, in Zimbabwe, when it first became independent in the 1980s, they said, we just need more teachers than we have time to train. So they had this alternating model where first year you're in teacher training full time, second year you're actually getting classroom teaching while doing distance learning, third year you're back in full time, fourth year you're again in the classroom doing distance learning, and then you complete your teacher education. So that was just a shortage of facilities and trainers, but they did that to balance. Teach for all. I mentioned I did teach for Malaysia. I know you have teach for Pakistan. In some countries, you have 2 years of classroom practice that actually feeds into the option to be a civil service teacher long term. I know that's not the case in Pakistan necessarily, but that's another way of just making sure people get lots of experience. So there's that curation element. Super quickly, the last thought really that I just wanted to leave you in is that when we look at the idea of being professional, I think we really need to look beyond sort of the status markers of what you're paid, how impressive your qualifications sound, and really engage with what your qualifications are equipping you to do, to be capable at and to be socialized to committed to, because a profession isn't really just about status or prestige, but it's about the shared creed or the shared purpose of everyone aspiring to fulfill, right? This is just a quote from Stigler and Hebert. This was a study they did in Japan and Germany and the US. And a couple of notes here. So one is just by saying that it's about a body of professional knowledge. What they say about teaching, right? This aligns with, I think, something that Professor Jennifer Gore said in the first session of the dialogue, where she said it's more important to focus on improving teaching than improving teachers. In terms of what kinds of knowledge are needed, well, I think lots of people on this call know it's not just about subject matter and instructional techniques, but knowing how these two come together practically to understand how children learn particular bodies of work. And this is just to circle back to somewhere where we started, that if you think about the desire to improve teacher practices and the professional knowledge needed to do so, that actually aligns very well with the core purpose and the technical practices in effective organizations that we started with. So I think I've actually gone a bit over time. So thank you very much. I'm so looking forward to the discussion.
No, I think you're actually right on time. And I think everyone, hopefully, I was enjoying the slides very much. So I hope everyone else is enjoying them as well. I have so many questions, Wade, but thank you for sharing a lot of those really powerful insights. And I think I want to start from the end, which is like towards the end, you know, you're saying last slide is almost like a manifesto requirement for teaching, where if you have a shared purpose, it has to be kind of professed, it has to be declared, it has to be something that everyone can, you know, commit to. And that only happens when enough people have sat down and had that conversation around what does it mean to be a teacher, right? Especially at different levels of school. You know, this is a nice, I think this is a nice point. I'll hold all my other questions for later. This is a good time to pivot towards Siddiqui Saab. Shahid Saab, you were formerly Vice Chancellor of the Allama Iqbal Open University here in Pakistan, which runs one of the largest distance learning teacher education programs in the country. You know, what has that experience been like? What were some of the big gains? And what are some of the challenges that you've experienced? And what does that tell us about how we're thinking about teaching in the Pakistan context, especially at the school level?
Okay, thanks very much. And let me start with, my thanks for Sophia. I think it's a wonderful initiative started by you and by LUMS. And I was enjoying the presentation by UAE, and a couple of things maybe later on we can discuss. For instance, this idea of choosing and curating is very interesting. And the other thing she highlighted is the practical work, which I think are very common, features. And maybe after this, we'll be discussing more on those 2 points. Well, I'll be sharing with you, my insights, because I happen to work in different teacher education institutions like IID, Khan University, and then at Allama Iqbal Open University, which is a mega university with 1.3 million students. It's a distance education university, second in the world and first in Asia. So my talk will be based on my own personal observation as I was listening to a global picture by UAE. Okay, can we? Okay, just a minute. Let me. Yeah, I think let's start with this discussion because in Pakistan, we have been having these discussions, conferences, how to improve the quality of education. And we're talking about curriculum and textbooks and infrastructures and assessment system. And currently, we are having, a lot of discussion on single national curriculum as well. But I think that in the center is teacher, because it's the teacher whose interaction with these textbooks and curriculum and students and assessment makes curriculum. So again, that is one point which we should be discussing later on, that what is the place of teacher education in single national curriculum. Then I think in the 21st century, the implication for teacher education, um, especially when the pace of change has been expedited so many times, and this 21st century has become such a competitive century. I think there are direct implications for teachers. And as we see that, there's the skills which are going to be very relevant in 21st century, including creativity, critical thinking, communication, collaboration. Um, the direct implication for our teacher education programs are we producing critical thinkers? Are we producing thinking teachers? Because only thinking teachers can produce thinking students or thinking citizens. Um, if we agree that teacher is in the center, then we need to empower teachers, and that is one very important means of this empowerment is teacher education. So here comes my own personal experience of working in Pakistan as a teacher educator in different provinces. I work in Sindh, in Punjab, in KP as well. And here I'll be sharing with you those experiences, what I saw, and what I think, to me, what are the actual gaps in these teacher education programs. When we talk of teacher development, I think I see teachers' professional development with three different directions: knowledge, skills, and attitude. And then if we are serious about bringing a change in our classrooms and in society, I think we need to take this route of holistic view of change. That means that we should be working at three different levels: conceptual change, pedagogical change, and attitudinal change for teachers and in teacher education programs. Coming to the teacher education programs in Pakistan, we have teacher education programs in public sector. Then we have AIOU, that is Allama Iqbal Open University, and then private sector programs. But public sector programs are in the majority. And AIOU, as Sophia mentioned, it's important to mention here that this university is engaged in teacher education programs at different levels. And let me share with you the figures, which are amazing. For instance, they are offering B.Ed 1.5 years, and there are 35,000 students enrolled in this, 35,000. Similarly, B.Ed 2, B.Ed 1.5 entry point is after 16 years of education. B.Ed 2.5 years, 6,400 students, and entry point is after 14 years of education. And then B.Ed 4 years, 39,000 teachers are enrolled, and entry is after 12 years of education. And then MA and MEd, 40,000 teachers, and the entry is after 14 years. I won't go into details of these programs, but I think I would like to hint that the biggest problem in education sector in Pakistan is that of scale, because we can bring changes at small level. As I shared with you, I worked with LUMS, I worked with Aga Khan University and GAK Institute. It's much easier to bring changes there, but the moment we scale up things, there is a danger that the quality is diluted. After looking at these programs in public sector and AIOU, and working with private sector, universities, I came across some very major observations, and that I would like to share with you. I think one important observation is that most of our teacher education programs in public sector, they are unidirectional. The whole emphasis is on method. or pedagogy. And, the other two levels, that is conceptual level and attitudinal level, they are, underestimated or not tapped. Maybe that, it's very difficult to demonstrate change at those two levels, conceptual change and attitudinal change. But that is what is happening, that the whole emphasis has gone to method, and we give a handful of strategies and skills to the teachers, and we think that we have, trained a teacher. Um, Another very, important observation is that the teacher educators themselves, there is a gap between what they profess and what they actually do in classroom. For instance, I've seen teacher educators who advocate for a democratic pedagogy or critical pedagogy, but in their own classroom, uh, you know, students cannot ask questions. And there is, so I think this backfires the students who are, sitting there. They think that in practical life, it's not possible. These are just bookish things. Um, Another very important point you mentioned this, the practical, component of teacher education programs. And I personally think that they are very important component. But in Pakistan, in most of the teacher education programs, teaching practice is just a formality. It is lumped towards the end, or maybe in the middle or in the beginning. And it's not adequate, and there's a clear disconnect between curriculum and this, teaching practice. So as a result, it is highly ineffective. That is my third observation about our teacher education programs. Then I think in most of the teacher education programs, um, the pedagogy or the approach or the philosophy is transmission based. How to transmit knowledge or skills and values to the students. And there are three big assumptions in this approach. A, that knowledge is fixed and it is out there. And B, students are empty vessels, are clean slates. And C, the teacher is Mr. Know-all or Miss Know-all. So as a result, the students, they write good exam papers, they get very good marks. But as far as the change is concerned, we don't see any significant change in their pedagogy or in the classroom. Similarly, lack of reflection. In most of the teacher education programs, I don't see this component. I remember that when I was teaching at Khan University, I used to teach a module which was called reconceptualization. So I think there is, but here in most of the teacher education programs, this reflective practice or creativity, I don't see much of it in our programs. And as a result, it is a kind of conformity-based education. There is less room for disagreement, and these are the students who would go to the society and blinkers on. They will, fit into the slots of some jobs, and that's it. They're least concerned what is happening in the society. Then, after training, when they go to schools, head teacher plays a very important part. And there are not many good programs. I'm glad that LUMS has ELM, Educational Leadership and Management. We had started in IED long before, in 1998, I think, and then in Lahore. But there are, some universities where I personally think that besides teachers, we need to have good programs for educational leadership and management as well, because teachers are the key players. Um, so I was talking about that lack of sport. Um, this lack of sport in the workplace or in school is very, this impacts their performance badly. And initial, enthusiasm, it comes back to that, line of status quo. And I was listening to UAE where she was sharing with us an interview, a person who was very excited. Well, after some time, that enthusiasm goes down to that line of status quo. The reason is that there is no critical mass there, and the person is all alone. So that is very important. These are some of the challenges in Pakistan with teacher education programs. The challenge of scale, because there are so many schools where we don't have teachers. And secondly, there are so many schools where we don't have trained teachers. So this problem of scale is very important. The government is interested in crunching numbers. So thousands of teachers have been trained, but it's a constant struggle between quantity and quality. Lack of political will. When I say this, I think in Pakistan, if you look at the allocation of funds for education, it is one of the lowest in South Asia. And also, there is no monitoring policy. There is no policy of accountability. So that is another factor that we need to fix that. Then I think, especially, it would be interesting for UAE and others, because you mentioned choosing and curating. Because here in Pakistan, we don't have much control on selection of teachers, because there is a lot of political interference in terms of selection, in terms of promotions, and in terms of transfer as well. Political interference, plus there is a lot of demand. So, we cannot apply those kind of filters which we see in other countries. I also already mentioned about lack of sport. Then lack of interest on the part of employers. In different provinces of Pakistan, they have removed that qualification which used to be there when there was an advertisement for job. So they thought that maybe it's not important to have a qualified teacher. So that is also very demotivating. And finally, I think this is common, that there is low social status for teachers. So these are some of the challenges. And then I'll share with you some of, recommendations. And then I'll stop. I think my experience of working with teachers as a teacher educator, that they have a very poor self-image. They think that, they are helpless creature. They think since, curriculum is given to them, they cannot do anything. But then I'll share with them that, look, there is one curriculum which is given to you, and then that curriculum is translated into textbooks. It is changed. And when you teach that curriculum, it is further changed. And when the students learn, it's further changed. So you are in the center. You are not helpless creature, but you can make a difference. No matter whatever is the curriculum, you can enrich and enhance your curriculum. And what is required is a little creativity and some passion. So I think, but this is very important to start with for any teacher education program, to give them this, idea or strength that yes, you can do it. And then change at 3 levels: conceptual change, pedagogical change, and attitudinal change. I think unless all these levels are tapped in teacher education programs, we cannot see the impact of it in our classrooms. This reflection in action is very important, keeping in view the 21st century, educational framework where creativity and critical thinking are very important. So we need to, add some module, maybe a separate module, but this should run through all the modules, critical thinking, creativity, and reflective practice. Because, in the coming times, we don't need just technicians, but reflective, practitioners, thinking teachers who can produce thinking human beings. Then sports system at workplace. I think we should take school as a unit of change, so that when a teacher goes back to that school, there are 2-3 persons who can speak in the same language or same idiom, and they could have a critical mass, and then there will be a kind of ripple effect. And then like LUMS or like Khan, like some other universities, I think we need to introduce educational leadership and management programs in different universities. And also making them understand that it is not an event, but it's a process which is continuous and lifelong process. And there should be recurrent programs and opportunities for professional development. And finally, I think this full circle, coming back to that teaching profession, it's very important to have professional organizations for teachers, to provide a platform for professional interaction, to arrange an online repository of ideas, content, and skills in the teaching profession. Because my experience tells me that, after doing a program or workshop, they are lost. So if these professional organizations, could arrange a repository of ideas, content, and skills online, that would be great for the teachers. To organize seminars, workshops, and conferences in the relevant disciplines. And finally, to advocate at different levels for the social status of teachers. So these were some, my own observations based on my, personal experience of working with teachers as teacher educator. And I think it's such a long debate, and it's such an interesting subject. But I think I should stop here, and we can take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahid. Especially, I'm loving that background on your slides. Very nice and colorful. I really appreciate the artwork there. Thanks so much for sharing these thoughts. I think there are some really big sticking points that you mentioned. One of them is scale. So Pakistan right now does have, if there's one country that really needs to be thinking about this particular dimension to policy kind of propositions, it's Pakistan, right? Where we have more than 50 million children to think about just in terms of school enrollment. And then we have a whole collection of students who they should be in school and they're not. And so, what's going to happen with their educational opportunity? And then how do you get enough teaching into the system to reach out to this variety of student clientele? And speaking of variety, I think I want to bring some of the thoughts that both of you have mentioned together. I want to go back to the example that you had mentioned where you had referred to Masuda Banu's work. I wanted to ask whether the teachers that she had been kind of speaking with for her research work were coming in from the public sector, or were they based in private schools? Just kind of probing whether there's something different to the environment there, which allows teachers to go above and beyond the call of official or stipulated duty in private schools. Because we know that in public schools, this happens in many other country contexts similar to Pakistan. So we've seen this in India as well. We see this in Bangladesh. the public teacher is a bureaucrat. And so, with permanence also comes compliance. And then there's a lot of instruction and expectation on behalf of the state to be doing not just teaching, but many, many duties outside of the classroom, outside of the school as well. And it doesn't have to be related to teaching necessarily. So it's just, one, what are some of your thoughts on other country cases that you've explored from this perspective? So how much does compliance as a bureaucrat start to weigh in on the everyday proportion of time which is available to teachers for teaching or teaching related activities? And two, in the particular Mr. Dabano case that was cited, were those teachers coming in from public or private schools?
Yeah, so I think to go a bit in reverse order, interestingly, in the case that Mr. Dabano cited, those teachers were in public schools, but the way they got over the critical mass problem that Dr. Siddiqui mentioned is that I said, oh, that's interesting that they managed to maintain their own counter norm. And she said, but the thing is, these teachers, all of these teachers that these excellent students mentioned were very senior. So they didn't feel the pressure. They had their own sense of legitimacy. They had their own sense of experience to be able to go above and beyond on their own, whatever pressure there was around there to just, let's do the minimum and collect our salary or whatever in their schools. Mr. Dabano actually has another paper where she looks at the work of the CARE Foundation, where I think what they do is that they try to help some low performing schools in public schools by sort of introducing a couple of like their own self-recruited, really high motivated teachers, and then introducing some basic accountabilities, and try to introduce both by that combination of like light touch monitoring, but also having these motivated teachers go in and try to identify other motivated teachers within their school and like build relationships with them and sustain that. So building toward that critical mass of motivation to shift the status quo that Dr. Siddiqui mentioned. So that's possible. But then she did mention that one challenge there was that sometimes when the school started doing too well, then the district would come in and be like, oh, actually, CARE Foundation, we want you to go away. Because if you show it's possible to do that well, then that puts pressure on us at the district level and all the other schools. So we don't actually want to shift the status quo. So that shows sort of, like, remember the donut thing I talked about, right? That shows that the purpose at the core there isn't actually helping children develop as much as they can. So that's sort of in terms of there's possibility for change even in challenging situations, but then the idea of sort of getting change to diffuse across the system as a whole is a whole other kettle of fish, right? And I think that relates very strongly to what you were saying about compliance as a bureaucrat. And I think that's one thing that we have seen across multiple countries in RISE and beyond, where sort of, whether it's just the number of responsibilities you have that relate to like administrative tasks or like helping to administer elections or collecting health data in the village because you're the most educated person and the state expects that of you. So whether it's the actual responsibilities taking teachers out of the classroom, and we have a colleague who's done a study, and I think teacher mindsets in say 9 developing countries, where a high proportion of teachers think that if you have legitimate reasons, meaning these other official administrative tasks, to leave the classroom, and as long as you let the kids do work, like give them some homework to do while you're gone, they see it as legitimate to just be completely absent from the classroom because you have these other priorities. So that's part of it, right? Just the time it takes. But then there's also I think, Sophia, in your work, you get to this, how it changes teachers' identities, their perception of what it is they're meant to do, their perception of what it is they're being paid to do. And we have a study from, I think this was a 2 or 3 year ethnographic study in Delhi looking at a reform, and they found that teachers felt like they were being made into secretaries. So maybe, and I think administrative work numerically was maybe something like 30-40% of their work. And of course, that's not ideal. That's very far from ideal, but it was less than half. And even then, because it's so, that sense of civil service obligations can be so dominant about your sense of self and your sense of identity, that just overwhelms any sense of I'm here to be a purpose-driven teacher. I'm here because my mission is to help children thrive. And that's very destructive. I'm not sure how far I rambled from your actual question, but yeah, those are some initial thoughts.
No, I think that's really helpful. And I'm assuming you're referring to the Yemeni IR paper where—
Yes, I am.
Yeah, and they looked at Bihar thing. And that's an interesting paper as well, because it spends a lot of time kind of taking what is traditionally used in other studies on bureaucrats and how they use their time, so time use surveys, And they borrow that concept and they use it, in the teaching space just to get a sense for really what do teachers do when they're not teaching. And there's a preliminary kind of exercise that we did when I was with the Punjab Education Department. We're finding that at least half of the year is spent doing some kind of activity which is not really directly related to teaching. And at some levels, it's not even indirectly related to teaching. So that's a large amount of the school year which is being spent kind of attending to many activities for which maybe other forms of human capacity need to be developed, right? Especially at local levels. So things which are somewhat related to education, such as knocking on doors and bringing kids back into school, some that maybe local bodies could be more responsible for, but they don't exist maybe, and that raises big questions of decentralization, and we can return to that at some point. But I think I want to come back to what you're pointing out. And this is what I'm hearing from both of you, this notion of, and I think that RISE really talks about this a lot, Diana Andrabi's been speaking about it a lot as well, this notion of teams, right? And how do we turn teachers into the champions of the system so that we can look at them differently? Shanta, I want to turn to you. There was one thing that you had mentioned on your slide of kind of, the big challenges that keep the system stuck in its status quo situation, which is that there's like a low social status associated with teaching. During your time as a VC of AIOU, what were some of the things that you recall either talking about or maybe hearing from stakeholders, whether teachers, students themselves, or other parts of the system, in an attempt to really turn around the way society is looking at teaching right now in the Pakistani context?
I think you're very right. And picking up on where Yui stopped, the role of teachers in Pakistan and the amount of time which is wasted. They are given the duty of conducting elections, for instance. If there is some VIP is coming to the country, they have to take the students to the airport or to the roads, these kind of things. And I think this is a direct impact on their self-image. Well, but I think we need to break this vicious circle somewhere, because we have been going into circles. And I think the only hope is that if we could manage to come up with some professional, platform, professional organizations where we can voice our problems, and where we have a platform to get together, and where there are ways to, empower the teachers, and where we can get that vocabulary to, to in this war of discourse, because most of the teachers, they don't know what to do. They are just victims of this, whole vicious circle. This reminds me a side problem of the assessment system, because sometimes the teacher education program is great, but when they go back to their schools, they, in Pakistan, they evaluate school where how many A's are there. The best teacher is the one whose class gets maximum A's. The best school is that that gets maximum A's. I think here the casualty is that of process, and the product is becomes more important. That it's not important that how a teacher unfolds his or her lesson plan in classroom, how he or she engages students, how he or she creates develops critical thinkers. But more important is that how many students of your class get A grades. That is another very important point, which is pulling down that enthusiasm of teachers, because after doing some creative work, then they have to toe that line of maximum A's. So I would like to have Yui, your take on this. How far this negative washback effect of testing assessment is, playing its role?
I think related to assessment. So there's many levels at which we want to think about this. It's a great point, right? Some people would say that if you change the assessment system at school, it will just kind of, signal to the entire system to change the way that they're thinking about what teachers need to be doing in the classroom. So changing their role almost from like instructors to facilitators, for instance. But then there's the quality of assessment of the teachers themselves when they are preparing to become teachers. So that's at a university level. But then there's also, for instance, this is a great question that's just come in from Faisal Badi, who's Dean of the School of Education. And he's wondering whether, and this has to do with when teachers are in service. Typically what's happening is that they're being evaluated on the basis of student outcomes. We know by now that student outcomes are driven by many factors other than what a teacher is doing in the classroom, but too often that correlation, or to some, unfortunately even causation, between how the teacher is doing and what the student is producing as an output is taken as a golden standard. So we're looking at us a result in Pakistan, for instance, and we know that our literacy and numeracy levels are not great. We're still kind of somewhere in the early to mid 60s on basic outcomes for students. But does that necessarily mean that that's a great way to look at whether teachers are doing their job in the classroom or not? And if it is, how can we make it better so that there's actually a feedback mechanism that can get back to either the teachers themselves or the system, which is producing teachers or continuously developing them professionally. So can I come back to you with this first? I know that you're not entirely familiar with the Pakistan context specifically, but want to hear from other cases whether we could learn something useful for Pakistan.
Yeah, just the first thing to agree with on the outset is, yes, there are so many levels and complexity, and absolutely there are so many things about education that are valuable and legitimate that aren't just about test scores. I completely agree with that. To just give a brief thought on the sort of, Sophia, what you were saying about the way assessment plays into the selection and training of teachers. I do think that's important here. I do think also that one thing that there are ways to think richly and rigorously about different aspects of teacher capability. To give, I think, an example that we say like unattainable and to some extent even undesirables, even in Malaysia, my own country. So in Finland, and I fully take the point that Finland is oversighted as best practice and many things can't be applied in other contexts, as I just said. In Finland, for people who are leaving secondary school who want to go into primary teacher education programs, there's this national test that changes every year that you have to take on the back of a, and it's a multiple choice test, but it's an incredibly hard multiple choice test because in order to take it, students are expected to read like 5 or something like that academic texts about teaching and education. So like 5 books or 5 really long journal articles and answer questions about that. So if you make it past that, that both shows a level of commitment to this thing called education and a level of ability to engage academically with research, because that's the expectation there that teachers have that research competence, which is again not the case and not something that is feasible, I think, for many other countries in the world. But just like some researchers, I think somewhere in the UK, are experimenting with electronically delivered situational judgment tests. So that gets at some of the 21st century aspects, say, that Dr. Siddiqui was talking about, beyond just, do you know these facts or not? So there are ways of thinking about that, but that's not so much my area of expertise. Now, in terms of student outcomes and assessment, I, again, fully agree with the point that they shouldn't be too narrow, but I think there's one challenge here is that because assessments and test scores have so much, I think, emotional value and also social mobility value for individual children and their families, the stakes can be really challenging and really different. And I think that But at the same time, I do think some amount of assessment of learning outcomes at the system level is important, because the whole reason we have a learning crisis, well, not the whole reason, but one reason we have a learning crisis in many developing countries is that at the international development level, there's a push to focus on enrollment and access, proportion of children enrolled in school. But then where that has left us now is that like half the kids who are in school aren't learning. We have data from like half of young women in the 50 countries in the demographic and health surveys have finished 6 years of primary school, but can't read like even a very simple forward sentence. And that's just a travesty. It's a waste of state resources. It's a waste of these young children's time. Like you spend hours and hours in school and you don't learn. So I think there is a real need to measure some amount of learning outcomes. And my personal opinion, this is not an opinion of RISE, because RISE is made of many diverse researchers with many views, is that I think there would be value in emphasizing standardized metrics at the baseline. So you have things like saying, if a child by 3rd grade isn't reading, if a child by 3rd grade can't do basic maths, the school needs to do something, the district needs to do something, the state needs to do something. And this can happen at the individual level, or it can happen at a sample-based level where you survey a couple of kids per class, couple of kids per school, and then the higher level, like the district or the state, needs to take action. But without that baseline, then we have so many children slipping through the cracks. But then I guess if it's half the kids, those aren't really cracks, right? Those are gaping holes. But I really think we should at the same time try to decrease pressure at the top, especially I think in many of our Asian education systems, where they basically become kind of filtration systems, where the goal is to select the smartest kids to go. I mean, in India, this would be to go to the Indian Institute of Technology or to go to the fanciest university, where it doesn't serve like 95% of the children or more in the country. And again, managing those incentives for teachers, for families, or whatever is so important, because education and exam scores have so much symbolic value and so much value for your career. Sorry, I think I've said to remember, but the third thought there is, I think something that both you, Sophia, and Dr. Siddiqui have mentioned, the idea of like school environment collaboration and also collaboration with professional associations is really important, because I think when this starts to be seen as an individual burden, the perverse incentives are worse. The incentives to improve things by cheating are worse, because it gets reduced so much more to what can you individual do to change that number. It's no longer about the student. It's no longer about the purpose as a whole.
Dr. Siddiqui, would you like to add to that? Especially.
I think it's a very important point you raised. I agree with Yui that we do need some standards, not only for students, but also for teachers, because if we are focusing on teaching as a profession, I think we need to, whether we like it or not, we need to have some standards. And this discussion will then lead to this issue of licensing. I totally agree with you that we must have some standards, and then we can match the performance of, and I think in the ASA report talks about that. And in many cases, the students were underperforming. And there are some very interesting studies after the post-COVID, how, loss of learning and how curtailed teaching instructions impacted the quality of learning and quality of education as well.
So I think what I'm hearing, and of course, I mean, we're not here to design policies with, a 90-minute session, but I think what I'm hearing is that we really do need to be thinking, the whole system needs to be moving towards a more balanced understanding of, yes, a low state assessment or a medium state assessment of teachers, where student outcomes can feature as one of many metrics that could be used to understand how teachers are doing in the classroom, but then maybe not immediately or directly tying it to their kind of career pathway. But then, obviously there's that question of, okay, so if we don't immediately tie student performance to teacher performance, on balance, I mean, when we look at Biosen's existing situation, just spending enough time in the system, especially as a public school teacher, just spending enough time will kind of rack up years and then you get a promotion. So it seems like these are two extremes almost, where in one situation you have to do literally nothing for years and years and you will still get to some stage. And on the other hand, it's too high stakes. So maybe finding some kind of middle ground
Balance,
is
yeah.
what
Yeah.
what we're going to have to move the system.
Yeah,
towards.
I think you're right, because when we try to find this, correlation between um, teaching and results, there is a problem with that, because students performs. There are so many other factors: students' own socioeconomic background, overall school milieu, where that school is situated, and there are so many factors there. Maybe if you take a teacher from, say, Patoki and bring it to some good school, that he or she can show performance, again, not because of teaching, but there are other factors as well. So we need to be careful, and as you said, we need to strike a balance between and because there are so many other factors that makes a teacher a good teacher.
Sophia, can I just jump in really briefly? I think one thing that's important to think about when designing the stakes and how much to relate, say, career structures and compensation to outcomes and things like that, that actually, I think there's a often unrecognized connection between that appropriate design of careers and compensation and one thing we talked about earlier, which is teacher voice through whatever forum, because this is one, when we talk about, oh, context matters, like researchers always say that, but often we're not very precise about what we mean by that. But one factor that's really important is that motivation functions differently in different contexts, because finances and salary have different significance in different contexts, right? So say, when I was doing my PhD research, I went to the two, by now very cliched countries of Singapore and Finland. And in Singapore, they have performance-based pay. It's almost corporate-like, where like top performing teachers can get a bonus of like 3.5 months salary every year. And then if you're the lowest performing, like you won't get promoted, blah, blah, blah. In Finland, there's no performance-based pay. And like teachers are like, ugh, I don't want performance-based pay, more money would be nice, but like that would just introduce inequality and competition into my profession. And I value my autonomy so much. So that's a long way of saying like those motivational factors are perceived differently and motivate people differently in different countries. And the study I mentioned earlier by Shritlana Sabharwal and other colleagues at the World Bank, where they surveyed teachers in different countries, and a lot of them were like, oh, there was wide agreement about things like, oh, we want to prioritize the smartest or the most hardworking kids in the class. But then there's very wide disagreement on whether teachers thought performance-based pay for the most effective teachers was appropriate or not. So that's a really long way of just saying, like, I think really one thing we need to do, and I don't know what Pakistani teachers would think, would be just simply ask teachers, like find the most committed teachers, the ones who have like stayed in the system and care and make a real difference, and ask them like, what do you want? What can we do to make your life better and to make more people be like you in the system? And that will look different in every country. And we just need to respect that. And yeah.
I think it's great that you've brought this up. Like, this is exactly, these are some of the thoughts that are going through my mind. There was a survey that was done a long time ago, 2014. I say a long time deliberately because we also had COVID and the whole world changed in the middle. But since 2014, we haven't really had that kind of survey again. And it wasn't something that was advocated through public systems. And I say that particularly because, Gulab Khan, who's also at the School of Education, is asking, like, when are systems going to realize that teacher agency is so critical to understanding how this entire formula will finally fall into place? And you're right, one way to really put your finger on the pulse of agency is just go and talk to the people that these policies are being designed for, or in fact, design those policies with them. So make it participatory, right? And I think one of the big challenges, especially when we talk about the scale in Pakistan, and I've mentioned this before, is how do we break it down to levels which are manageable? So do we unbundle policy components so that some parts of teacher policy happen at more centralized levels and other components happen at lower levels like district or sub-district levels? So where does hiring happen, for instance? We've got those gradations in the Pakistan context. We've got, primary schools are typically recruiting from districts. And then post-primary schools are recruited at provincial levels. And so there's expected to be a lot more mobility, but doesn't necessarily work out given all the other factors of teaching load and just how large primary school classrooms tend to be because it's a country with a very, very young population. And I think all of those are challenges that are feeding in, but one great takeaway that I'm hearing from this session is, not sure who would do it exactly, but this would be a good time, I think, to have some kind of a voice of teachers version 2 survey where the questions being posed to teachers across public and private schools in the Pakistan context, maybe they're thought through. There's questions around financial incentives and then non-financial incentives as well. And it could be based on all the, kind of the research which has been done so far, not just over here, but for instance, the work that you've been doing, where we're seeing these important lessons emerge from, for example, just the Finnish and the Singaporean cases, where two very different positions have to be taken for very different reasons. So I think that's a nice kind of takeaway. But I want to come back specifically to this question of experiential learning, maybe. And this is Shahid, you also mentioned this. You have, I know in our previous conversations as well, you're of the opinion that too much of the practical element to teacher preparation in Pakistan is bundled in towards the end of a program. And so there's a long time that you're kind of just spent immersed in like theory. And how the theory is taught is also a separate discussion. And that takes us in the realm of higher education teaching. So I don't want to go there just now. But we know that it's not great. And so that's not great. And then you have very little experiential learning opportunity. And before you know it, you're done. And now you're a teacher. What can we do to change that up? And especially, Shahid, you have worked with the HEC. The last time that the curriculum was revised for pre-service teacher education was maybe 2012, if I'm not wrong. Why do we have these long gaps in time before we really return to these big, powerful questions?
Okay. First, I didn't work with HEC for that. But I think this very important point, this practical training, as you said, and in our case, we call it teaching practice. I am quite skeptical about its, the way it is done in Pakistan, because lumping towards the end and, there is no link between curriculum and that pedagogy, and the way it is executed in schools, and there is no proper micro teaching, there are no observations, and there is no feedback towards that. But I think that there are so many ways we can expose our teacher to a number of new methodologies, new approaches. I personally think that we should try to develop this kind of inculcate this critical thinking or reflective practice, so that even after leaving this program, when he or she goes to any other context with very different circumstances, very different needs of students, he or she should be able to improvise or modify things according to the situation. And for that, I think it's very important to make our students, make our teachers realize that there are so many sources of professional development. Conferences are there, workshops are there, these library papers are there. But I think the biggest source of their professional development is within them. It's the teacher himself, herself. You can learn from your own action, right? That you just reflect on what you did in the last class, what things went well and why, what things didn't, were not very good and why, and how can I, plan it in such a way next time that. So I think that self motivation is very important because unless and until that person, the teacher, is self-driven, that kind of enthusiasm created by teacher education program, one odd workshop will die down after some time. So I think we have to make them realize that the biggest source of learning or professional development is you. And I think that is very important for me.
I mean, it sounds, we're not there yet, but it sounds like we might be onto something in terms of a teacher manifesto, right? Like if you have
Yeah.
to be the change that you want to see in the world kind of approach, right?
Yes.
Have you seen in your kind of cross-country research or in the literature review that you have been undertaking, have you seen instances where this kind of philosophy has been actively propagated? Who's been doing it? How's it worked out?
Well, this is very interesting. First, I think there are two ways I can respond to this question. As I said, I worked with Aachen University, IED, and it's a small place where I personally taught that course, reconceptualization. And one very interesting, technique which was used, that every student was asked to write a reflective journal. And after a week, I would get the reflective journals, and I will also respond to those journals. So, and we will tell them that, look, these journals, reflective journals, are not just diaries, right? But you have to, focus on some point, raise some question, but just raising question is not critical thinking. The second part, which is very important, is come up with some alternatives. That, this happened, you liked it, why did you like it? Well, if you think it's not, why it is, and what could be the alternative? So that is one place where I think we did that. In LUMS, a team taught a course, Learning in Community, where it was very interesting course. We took our students to Khaneval for 1 week. For UE, it's a village. It's not a village; it's a town. And we, divided them into groups, and people would go to different villages, and we, prepared a questionnaire before. So, but these are ivory towers, Khan University and LUMS. I think if we're talking of Pakistan, the real change, if we are looking for, unless and until we make a move in public sector, we cannot claim that change has taken place. With that, very interesting point, whether I think I'm just sharing it with you. I think we do need a movement in Pakistan that we should be writing. Teachers should be writing, not in research papers, but at least in the newspapers, in the magazines, for the sake of awareness, for advocacy. I think I wrote for a very long time, 15 years for Dawn and 5 years for the news, in very simple words about teachers. And from teachers' perspective, because most of the writings I see in Pakistan, they accuse teachers that, it is because of teachers the standard has gone down. And I would say that it's the teacher through which we can bring it up. So it's very interesting point. We can tag it with that suggestion of professional organization, that there should be, more and more writing in newspapers and, in simple way, just to create awareness that what are teachers' own constraints and how they are feeling, and how, if we want to improve education, teacher is the way, teacher is the, is in the center. Unless and until we empower teacher, we cannot, or we should not expect a qualitative improvement in our educational system.
Sophie, can I build on that point about professional organizations and teacher voice? So this is this is something that I think at the international, in the intergovernmental standard, there's a lot of affirmation for. So say the folks at UNESCO and the International Labour Organization, they talk about something called social dialogue, where basically you convene meaningfully convene representatives from the profession involved. So teaching and like employers and like service recipients, anytime you want to design policy for that profession. Unfortunately, in practice, often this doesn't happen for teaching. And really, sadly, this isn't actually just a developing country problem, but it's universal. And there's a scholar in the US called Jal Mehta who writes very interestingly about this. And he says he thinks one big problem with the teaching profession in the US is that it organized around labor union lines, not along a professional association sort of line. So teachers focus on, say, like advocating for better working hours, for salary, and they got that, but then they don't have the sort of moral and like professional legitimacy of, say, like medicine or teaching in the US. And I think how this plays out in many countries is that then when you do unionize as a union, then you leave yourself vulnerable to political capture. And teacher unions in many countries are just seen as like a voting bloc that the politicians just need to appease the people at the top. And again, I'm so sorry to bring in a cliched example from Finland, but say in Finland, the teacher union there is involved in any kind of salary negotiation with the government. Every few years they do this. But they also do things like every time there's a curricular change, they elaborate the curriculum for the teachers in that subject. They're like, we think you should interpret this way. We think this is how for science, for lower secondary school, this is how you deal with this curricular change. So it's both teacher well-being and the sort of professional knowledge and standards that enables you to argue for that well-being. And even though that's Finland's one example, at the other end, I spoke with someone for that teacher norms project, someone who used to be a deputy secretary general of the union in Uganda. And she said the one way they saw this play out was that sometimes when they wanted to introduce more sort of mission-driven programs from the international union side, then some of the union leaders would be like, no, we're about teachers' bread and butter issues. We're not about this other stuff. But then they help their leaders to see that, well, actually, but when you show that you care about children, about child labor, about learning, about professionalism, that's how you get the public to listen to you. So you can even make like an instrumental, cynical argument for like, if you want teachers to get more status and more salary, you need to show that you are a profession, even though, of course, we think the show your profession part is actually more important. But yeah.
Yeah, but can I pitch in? I think I can share with you two examples. My own area of specialization is language education, English. There is one good example of SPELT. Maybe Sophia, you know that. Society of Pakistan English Language Teachers. There is a newly established Pak Desol, which is just established in all the provinces, and they are going to organize a conference in October, and they are so I'm aware of these two. So these kind of not trade unions, and there is a danger that but these professional organizations can help our teachers through workshops, through awareness, through the voice, as we have been talking about.
I think we, if we wanted to, we could go on for a few more hours about this. Unfortunately, running short on time. Just one final thing that I wanted to add, and then we'll wrap up, is there's this global teacher prize. And I think a couple of years ago, there was a teacher from Pakistan who was maybe nominated, and I think she was even selected, and she might actually have been coming through the AHA network. And it's just interesting, like when she won, so I was in England, I found out through everybody who was not Pakistani, that a Pakistani teacher had won the prize that year. And it's just interesting, right? It's just, it reveals so much about just what makes the front news for Pakistanis. And so maybe there's a little bit of, we're putting a lot of pressure on teachers, but maybe there's a little bit of shapeshifting that everybody needs to be thinking about because, every family has some kind of family member in a school somewhere, whether it's a high-cost private school or a government school. And it's just important to bring that voice out and really be making the push. If not so much for the teachers, at least for the students, right? Otherwise, what else is the child-centered kind of policy framework about? Unfortunately, we've got to wrap up now, but thank you so much. Yuri, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciated the insights from different parts of the world. And, you said that it was, at the risk of being cliche, but I think we needed to hear a little bit more about those cliches of Singapore and Finland. Those are two country contexts that get thrown out a lot as references in Pakistani educational discourses, but we never really unpack the multiple dimensions to how those systems have built themselves up. So that was incredibly helpful. And thank you so much for your presentation and all the ideas that you've contributed towards. Shahid-san, thank you so much for joining us. I think, I'm personally very happy to have been able to connect with you. You're not too far from us. Hopefully we'll see a lot more engagement, and hopefully you will get to host you in Pakistan soon enough, and we can pick up this conversation again in person. So to all our viewers, thank you for joining us. And if you have any additional questions, you can always reach out to me. I'm at the School of Education, or you can reach out through LUMS Live, and we can send those questions onwards to the speakers if you are interested later on. But until next time, thank you very much, and everyone have a very nice day.